Are you ready to embark on a transformative journey of rebuilding your life? Look no further than the Rebuild podcast. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that nurture personal and spiritual growth. Through the wisdom of the Word of God and practical applications, we'll guide you towards becoming the best version of yourself. On this podcast, we will delve into a variety of topics and insights, ranging from mental and emotional well-being to personal development and spiritual growth. Together, we'll explore the paths to healing, resilience, and the restoration of inner peace. Subscribe now and let's rebuild our lives together, one uplifting conversation at a time.
Hello everybody, and welcome to the Rebuild podcast. I'm your host, Sean Romy, and today I want to talk about a topic that I think we've created a huge gray area for. This particular topic, it has great intentions, but I think we've been given a lot of misinformations. We've been putting ourselves in position where we find ourselves on the cusp of really not understanding the fine line between the one side and the other. And it leaves us with a lot of questions on how to handle this thing. And that subject, ladies and gentlemen, is fear. Now, on one side, there is a respect fear, and we're going to talk about what respect in that regard of fear is. And then there's terror fear. We're going to talk about terror and what that kind of fear is, and why our understanding of those two elements create a lot of questions. You know, again, we kind of blur the line with these two, and we pretty much think of them as one the same, when in reality they're far from it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into this. And I'll start it off by saying this. One of the reasons why I really chose to call this or create this subject is essentially just based on my experience growing up. We were always taught in the church to have fear for God, and you know, a lot of us, when we get into the whole concept of talking about fear, and this is people that are inside of the church as well as outside of the church, because a lot of us, especially in the communities that maybe are more religious, you have a lot of people who will out of their mouth say that they are not afraid of anything, or they don't fear anything except God. And I'd always been curious behind that, like, why is that a thing? And like I said, today I want to really focus on this element and being able to clear up the difference between respect and terror as it pertains to the word fear, so that we can know how to navigate through this thing, and we can stop really essentially blurring this line, because we don't want to create terror and think that is respect, and we don't want to push respect from an attitude that we have to make people afraid of us. So as usual, we normally try to do definitions, or we pull up Bible verses to kind of help us with regard to this. So we're going to start off with a couple of Bible verses. And this Bible verse is going to help us with the understanding of fear itself. Now, like I said, there's two different types of fear. There's terror fear, and then there's respect fear. So with regard to terror fear, we're going to turn to 2 Timothy verse 1, or chapter 1 and verse 7, which states that, "For God hath not given us the spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. And then for the other side, we have Philippians chapter 2 and verse 12, which says, "Wherefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your own soul salvation with fear and trembling." Now, with regard to fear, again, these are two different types of fear, from understanding of what it is that we come to understand. From the standpoint in what we saw in 2 Timothy, this is that terror fear. This is being afraid. This is, being in a place of being terrorized. Whereas in Philippians chapter 2, this whole fear is a respect. It's a reverence. And in fact, even with the words that are used, fear and trembling, when in the Greek, when put together, this fear and trembling is actually representative of reverence. They have to be put together. It can't be separate, because separate, they too represent terror, fear. But this put together is utilized as a reverence. And again, this is the foundation by which we understand that there are these two elements. Now, with regard to the English definition of fear, we'll see there's a lot of different versions here. Fear is an unpleasant and often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. It's an anxious concern. It's also a profound reverence and awe, especially towards God. It's a reason for alarm. It's to be afraid of. It's to expect. It's to have a reverential awe of, or frighten, or to feel fear in oneself. Now, we've gotten the English definition, and again, in the Bible, we have the different wordings with regard to the different types, and they both mirror each other in that regard. This also leads to one of the common misconceptions or challenges with regard to the word fear. See, fear is a homonym, right? Because we can use it in either case, and in that we will misuse it, right? And this is why we have to be careful and mindful of how we use the words, so we don't use them the wrong way. But we'll oftentimes misuse fear, and we'll utilize terror fear as a means of respect and awe and reverence, and those two are not the same. From the surface, we might think of them as the same, but in reality, they're far from it. In fact, when we go back to the definitions, if this is an unpleasant feeling, that means that there's something we're expecting to happen, usually at the sight of danger. So if I say something wrong, or if I do something wrong and I anticipate someone going to retaliate, that's a certain kind of fear. Now, for a lot of us, our understanding of that same fear in the reverence regard, it mirrors each other. But here's the difference between that reverence fear and that terror fear. With reverence, I don't want to make the mistake because of the potential letdown. Not just myself, but the person that I'm letting down, the disappointment. Now, this does not mean that I'm going to be perfect. But this also opens the door for me to understand that everything that I'm doing, I have to be very cautious of. But I'm not afraid to go out and do something. But again, because we've blurred this line so much, so we do turn this reverence thing into a fear thing. And I know for a lot of us, we get into the whole idea, we get into the concept, especially when we're talking about discipleship. We get into the idea that if a person messes up, that, we have to come down hard on them and harsh, and that anticipation also creates a certain level of fear because no one wants to be pointed out in that regard. So I'd be afraid to share if I have been struggling in some area or if I've done something wrong, because I don't want to have that attack of judgment. I don't want to be put in the spotlight. I don't want to be made that example of where you're basically embarrassing me or treating me as if I'm some terrible person. And the odd thing about that is we oftentimes open the door to say we all fall short. Well, if we all fall short, then we should embrace them making the mistake and encouraging them not to make the mistake again, and helping them to learn how to navigate through those issues and problems, vice lashing out. And that's, again, where we can find a lot of the difference with regard to us leading from a place of reverence as opposed to terror, and also blurring the line between the two. Because if I'm leading from that place and calling it respect, then the only way that I'll ever get into a place of feeling respect is through control. And control usually is very demanding, for lack of better words. Now, when we get into other things to consider with regard to fear, we can create a lot of boundaries, a lot of walls, a lot of setbacks, a lot of pitfalls. We can create a lot of reservations, hesitations, and other things of the sort, because we don't want to experience anything negative. Coming from the community where I come from, that's a commonplace kind of thing. We don't step into things outside of our comfort zone. And the downside to that is we say that we want to be faithful, but we're not stepping out on faith because we're staying where it's safe. And a lot of us are afraid of being in the place of struggling, or being in the place of falling short, or messing up, or not knowing what to do, or really being in a place where we're essentially out of control. These elements are not within our realm of control, so we will stay where it's safe, and we're expecting other people or other things to take fold. And the downside to doing that too is this also opens the door for us to be even the more judgmental towards people that are actually doing the thing that we come across being reserved behind our own selves about. I can think of numerous times within my lifetime where I would step out on something, I would do something different, and I would be being ridiculed and judged behind those things. My sophomore and junior year of high school is a great example of this. So I was we had a golf team for a few years. The team didn't last very long. Not exactly sure what the issue was, but what I can say is during those 2 years, I would do the same thing I would with anything else I was working on. I would try to find myself putting in work. We had a nice sized yard, and I would go outside and I would practice. Um, Sometimes the lawn would be pretty well maintained, so it was nice to kind of work from a place that resembled where, it might not have been perfect in terms of like a green or maybe even a fairway, but a fringe, not so bad. I could work with that. Not only that, but again, I'm trying to get to the concept of working on my form. Because outside of being able to go to the golf course to practice ever so often, and the match days that we will have, and being a multi-sport athlete, among other things, I didn't really have a lot of time to practice in that regard. So whatever time I did make for this, I would try to take full advantage of. And I admit, when I took out time to be a part of this team, I wasn't really good at it. I was really terrible, I'm okay to admit that. But I also remember at one point I was actually outside working on the craft, and I was taking some shots with a couple of plastic balls, and there's a couple of people that were actually they walked past the yard and they saw me out here working on my shot, and they were like, "Yeah, I want to see you hit one of the balls." And I'm like, "All right." And I told them beforehand, just so you know, this is a plastic ball, so it's not gonna go far. So don't expect to see that, right? So I take a swing and the ball it doesn't go far. Right, the wind kind of picks it up. It doesn't go far, and I remember the laugh I got behind it. The ridicule and all. And I'm thinking to myself, like, okay. And part of me wanted to be like, I'd love to see you come out here and try it. Like, I had no problem with it. I mean, the clubs weren't mine anyway; they belonged to the school. But same thing, And I can imagine a lot of them just, nah, we ain't finna do that. Okay. But again, it comes with that territory, right? A lot of us don't really step outside of that place. And a lot of us are afraid of looking bad or failing or, something to that extent. So we'll stay where we're comfortable. And we'll take our chances and step out in places where it seems to make sense, where we don't really explore. And it hurts us in a lot of ways. Again, in that same regard, when we find ourselves victims of certain circumstances, being abused, being hurt, being rejected, being left behind, being separated, whatever the case may be, we can find ourselves building up these things as well to keep us from feeling the hurt and the pain. And sometimes we choose not to deal with those hurts and pains, and we'll suppress them, we'll supplant them, we'll do all of these other things because we're afraid of really being honest about where we are with these things. And that's never a good thing either, because that creates a certain level of delusion, for lack of better words, because we suddenly believe that, we're not as bad as maybe the truth that may be uncovered dictates or could dictate. So we do have to understand the dynamic of the reverence and the fear and the terror with regard to how we operate, so we don't find ourselves creating boundaries out of a place of fear. Because in all honesty, reverence is a very transparent thing. When we're respectful, it's a freedom of energy, freedom of flow. I know a lot of people might consider, well, energy, why would you say energy? If we get into the idea or the concept of the spiritual nature of things, the spirit flows very freely. So again, all these walls and things that we create hinder that and block that, and how it makes it difficult for us to operate and navigate who we are as a result of being able to do that. So we have to be able to understand the dynamic of fear from that place. Before we get any further into that, let's talk about terror, because that's another one of those elements we have to consider. Now, terror is a state of intense or overwhelming fear, which kind of backs up one side of fear. It's violence or the threat of violence used as a weapon of intimidation or coercion. This is manipulation 101. And it's not necessarily that it has to be violence. It can be any type of thing to hold on to a certain level of control. A very frightening or terrifying aspect. This is what creates those walls and pitfalls and setbacks and boundaries and barriers and everything else, because we're thinking of these things worst case scenario, and instead of challenging ourselves or stepping out on faith, we'll stay where it's safe. This is someone or something that inspires fear, which fear is also another one of those elements that we can say that creates a lot of division and things along that line as well, or discord. This is the better word I was trying to consider is discord, because with discord, everything is in disarray. Everything's all over the place, right? And a lot of times when we are terrified, or we're afraid, or we're scared, or whatever you want to call it, a lot of times we're all over the place. I can think about times where there were decisions I wanted to make, but thinking of all of the worst case scenarios possible, I would choose not to go down that path, and I would do something different, because I'm all over the place. Terror is also an extremely disruptive or annoying person or thing. Again, creating discord, just like we just talked about. Now, for a lot of us, we consider, and this is one of those challenges that comes with terror. We oftentimes, when we think of terror or terrorism or terrorists, a lot of times we think of the things that we see in media. We might think of specific types of people, sometimes from a foreign place, sometimes from a place that is uncommon to our understanding of certain culture. Even from a domestic standpoint, it's the same thing. We can talk about terror from different racial groups or ethnic groups that we see here in the United States. So it's one of those, again, we oftentimes link this to people, and they're just out to be evil and no good and just be disruptive, etc., etc. And because of that, we kind of miss one of the big challenges with regard to that misconception, thinking that everybody in that regard is a terrorist from the perspective of what we see, or what we're portrayed with, or what we're led with. But one of the hugest challenges that we have with regard to terror is a lot of the people who we do or we can view as terrorists have come from some form of oppression. I know that's going to throw a lot of people off because, well, how do certain people get considered or wrapped in or find themselves in a place of being oppressed? Well, when you consider what oppression is, right, it's forcing people to adhere to something that they otherwise would have the freedom to do their own thing with. And it's a very open thing, so you can imagine just how far this thing can go. And yes, even oppressors can feel or find themselves being oppressed, right? Especially if enough people find themselves standing up against this thing. Now they're, again, with regard to a lot of the walls that we create, the misconceptions that we have about ourselves in some cases, understanding the dynamic of the intent, right? Sometimes because we feel our intentions might be in a good place or from a solid place, then we won't be, we're not wrong. Consider Saul as a great example of this, where, he thought he was doing what he was supposed to be doing because he was a religious leader, and he was standing up against people who were standing up against what he was believing in. And then he found out that that was far from the truth. A lot of us also understand from a place of being oppressed, and this is one of the hugest challenges and misconceptions in that element, is we believe that intimidation, manipulation, or coercion is the only way to get others to comply or to follow, which is why you can see a lot of chaos that ensues from places like that, where we'll try to create whatever narrative we can to get people to fall in line with what we want. And then we wonder why there's so much discord with regard to this element of terror and this element of, quote, fear, because you don't really know what's real and what's not, especially if everybody's going down showcasing as much information or misinformation about a certain thing as possible. It's kind of one of the huge pitfalls with regards to the social media age, is everybody's putting information out, and it leads to a lot of discord because you don't know what's what. And somebody might put something out and it sounds nice, or it sounds real, or it sounds authentic, and so we go along with that, and then we come to find out that it wasn't true. And now we have to unlearn this thing that we learned to go about in a different kind of mentality. It's a terrible place to be. Oftentimes when we perpetuate this method of control, we don't see the damage caused by our thoughts and actions. Again, a lot of times the things that we might be standing up for or we might be believing in, we think that they're from a good or a wholesome place. I know a great example of this, and for a lot of people that might argue this element comes from a standpoint of, the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, where Africans were being sent all over and forced into slave labor for centuries across a good portion of the continent of the Americas, North and South America, as well as Europe. And a lot of people, might be upset behind this and well, all these people taking advantage of us and doing this, that, and the third, and so on and so forth. And yeah, that's true. It did happen. But we also, from our place, we also might look at them and not realize that even though from our moral compass, we knew it was wrong. Some of those people didn't think it was wrong. And it's not so much that they knew better, but they were given information or misinformation that, basically created a picture to say that these people were easy targets. I can manipulate them. I can take control of them. In fact, when we consider what colonialism is as a whole, a lot of places that we see around the world that have ties to colonialism, which is essentially everywhere in the world, there's a similar theme, there's a similar story. But those that were carrying this thing out, again, didn't really see that there was something wrong with this. It was all for the greater good. And what we really fail to see, because we focus a lot on the surface of this thing, right, with the way that things happen and looking at the circumstances at that level, we kind of miss how the fear mongering and scaremongering is a byproduct of all of this. And even if we do recognize it, we really either fall victim to it by just accepting it, or we get into this place of we don't really want to challenge it as we really believe we should, because we're afraid. We know that those that are in charge are going to inflict some kind of violence or a threat of violence as a means of us being intimidated, or again to get us to fall in line. I think about this book I was supposed to read in college. I think about 2 or 3 of the classes I had in the different schools that I went to made mention of this book, and it really wasn't until I was out of school and I'd actually saw the movie that I actually was able to really see the dynamic of what was being described in the book 1984. And you think about what they were doing and how they were going about doing it, and the way that they were forcing the people to follow this guideline, and we were just victims. We were forced to fall in line with whatever our leaders' agenda was. And we missed that, and so then we make a decision. You think about a movie like The Matrix. The Matrix is the same thing, right? I forget which movie it was in the trilogy, but there's a scene where one of the guys that was awakened gets to a point where he really wishes he would have just stayed ignorant to everything and would much rather go back to the way that things were for him and be in that blissful state, as opposed to living in what the reality was. And sometimes people find themselves in that place too. Sometimes you can find freedom fighters in positions like that, where they might realize that maybe this thing might not be the right thing, or maybe this thing has gone too far, or maybe I'm doing too much. The burden is too heavy, it's too great, or maybe I don't want to go through this process of having to look over my shoulders, and I'm worried about this, or I'm searching for this, or people are looking at this, or people are infiltrating this, and all of these other things. And so many other elements with that regard. And so with regard to this dynamic of terror, we do have to be mindful that terror is a lot bigger than just putting people into a perspective of just saying they're just inflicting violence. Because they're actually operating on both sides of the perspective or the spectrum as a victim and as an oppressor. If we really broke down the dynamic behind a movement like, say, ISIS, for example, since a lot of people have been talking a lot about ISIS and a lot of what that movement was. While under the leadership of a guy like a Saddam Hussein prior to the war on Iraq and terrorism, whatever else we want to call it, everything was a certain way. You think about the way things were in a place like Libya. And I'm not saying that I'm on one side of this political thing or another. But what I can say is where there were elements across the entire Levant where things were one way and things seemed to be what we would consider normal, we go in and we infiltrate and we try to colonialize this thing. And as a result, those who experienced the terrorism of us coming in and destroying what was a normal way of life, maybe for them, and imposing ourselves on them, they have now taken up arms and saying, we're going to, in our defense, because you guys came in and you're forcing your ways on us, we're going to impose ourselves back on you. And we're going to do it the same way. We're going to fight fire with fire. And when you get to that place, you can see, oh, well, they're doing nothing different than what these guys are doing. It's just they have the backing. They don't have the backing of official governments the way that the governments have the backing of the government. And like I said, I'm not trying to be all political. I'm not trying to go down that path, but just as an example, right? When we think of movements like that, it comes into that same vein. But again, that explains, especially within the realm of how we understand fear, we kind of do the same thing. So with regard to fear and terror, we see that there's this dynamic of anticipation and there's this overwhelming excitement where something is going to happen or bound to happen, and we're apprehensive to really step into a certain place. Now, the last element that we'll take into consideration here is respect. And there's two verses that we'll utilize to help us out with this one too. Titus chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. It says, in all things, showing thyself a pattern of good works, in doctrine, showing uncorruptness, gravity, sincerity, sound speech, that cannot be condemned, that he that is of the contrary part may be ashamed, having no evil thing to say of you. And then 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 15 through 17. And they say, for so is the will of God, that with well doing ye may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as servants of good. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, and honor the king. Now, when we take into consideration the idea of respect, as we see in 1 Peter, there's the word honor, there's the word fear, And again, not the same fear that we're accustomed to seeing, but honor, reverence, respect. And when we define respect in the English language, it's a relation or reference to a particular thing or situation. It's an act of giving particular attention. It's a high or special regard. There's detail. It's something particular. It's something to consider worthy of high regard. This is to refrain from interfering with or to have reference to. And now you can see why the idea of respect fear and terror fear kind of do have this blend of a blurry element, because with regard to the way that we understand fear, we don't, the people that may practice or be in control don't want something to be interfered with. They want this thing to be regarded, right? So you're going to do what you can to keep this thing flowing, and you don't want anything getting in the way of that. That's misuse, if you will. But with regard to this particular word, respect, one of the many misconceptions that we have is that we oftentimes say out of our mouths that we respect something or someone, but we really don't know what that really looks like outside of the terror thing, right? Again, like we just explained. So we'll speak about respecting others, doing unto others as we would have them do unto us, and the golden rule, and all of these different guidelines we have in play that teach this element of being able to showcase love and respect and care for one another. But many times we intrude, we interfere, we impede, we impose, and we judge. And a lot of times that comes from the place of us not being whole within ourselves, right? Because as we talked about with the whole the terror side of things, when we're in a place of being controlled, when we're in a place of being oppressed, our understanding of respect from that place or that fear in that place is that's the only way that we know how to showcase respect. I have to impede and impose, and I have to get in the way of. And that goes against the idea of respect in the first place, because we're not supposed to interfere. Now, when I say not interfering, I don't mean from the standpoint of intervention. What I'm speaking to in regard to this interfering is more so from a control standpoint. I know a lot of us utilize the phrase a lot of times, I know what's best for you. And a lot of times the problem with that, from that place, is what we're really saying, and what we're really translating by saying that is, I want you to do what I want you to do. And that really hinders the person from being able to find themselves. And so from that place, again, because we understand that and we lead from that place, we'll take for granted what we really are saying from a respect place. But that also comes with that comes with that territory, right? I've talked about this from the standpoint of the punishment aspect too. And in fact, I had a conversation with my mom about this not a while back, and this is one of those where, if we were really going to break down some of the cycles that we've experienced in our community, the Black community, for instance, one of the things that we would really have to understand is the dynamic of punishment. Many of us have come from a place where we were taught sparing the rod is to spoil a child. Yes, it is in the Bible, but our understanding of the rod, because of the dynamic that we've experienced as a culture in the American culture, it stems from that rod. Whether it was a whip, whether it was some other form of abuse, it could have been physical abuse, hands, fists, legs. It could have been sexual abuse, sexual assault, rape, sodomy, right? It could have been something even more gruesome, right? Loss of limb, death. That thing that we've been taught from that place, that has carried over into our culture. And while no, we might not go so far as to do some of the more heinous things, those elements are still there. And subconsciously, we do find ourselves in a place where we have to address this thing. Because even the way that we respond, and it goes back to the terror thing, goes back to the fear thing. When someone says something or does something that crosses a line, we react. And in that reaction, we instill a certain level of terror and a certain level of fear. And again, that causes us again to blur a certain line. And we find ourselves trying to find how to balance this blurry line, because on the one side it's justified, right? In the home it's okay, but then in that same breath, we judge the subculture, the street life. Well, that's wrong, but the principles are the same. If a guy says something or does something that crosses a line, it's immediately intimidation to get him to fall back into a line or to teach him a lesson. A lot of us, and this is the same thing. And we take a very stern and intimidating tone and posture. And we question it. I know that's going to throw a lot of people off, and it might cause a lot of concern and drama along that line, and I understand that, but do understand that from that place, we do have to understand that all of these things are connected in that way. So we have to understand, with regard to this whole element of respect, with regard to the element of fear, with regard to the element of terror, that we have to know where we are in terms of how we're going about this fear thing. Because yes, in the Bible, fear is in the Bible a lot. And again, I know that for many of us, we are aware that the Bible is written, it's transliterated into the English, but it was written in the Hebrew and it was written in the Greek. And before that, it was written in Aramaic and other languages that might no longer be usable, which is understandable. But if we were to take the time to go and look up the words and what some of those words mean, we could find ways to understand what's really being said, and in some cases even cross-referencing what's being spoken, so that we don't find ourselves reading this thing out of context. It'll help us. Now, from a place of fear, we can look at couple of different things. One of the dangers of fear, if we look at this danger from terror, fear, we can find ourselves dealing with a lot of physical and mental health issues, right? Because we're not stepping into who we are, we're creating boundaries and other things of the sort, which those things being suppressed can cause sicknesses and other certain problems. There's a lot of reports that can back this claim, especially from a place of unforgiveness, stress, depression. Again, mental health in and of itself, right? We have a lot of people that experience a lot of trauma, might not know how to deal with certain things. We can find some stunted growth and development spiritually and emotionally, even from a personality perspective. We can find ourselves being stunted because we're not allowing ourselves to develop and evolve as we're supposed to. Right? If you were to take into consideration, like eating a certain food item, like let's say a pizza. Most of us, when we cut up a pizza, we cut it up into slices. And there's usually a format that will eat it. You eat a slice at a time. If it's a triangle slice, and you eat them in the triangles until you're about done. Some of us cut them into the squares, right? We slice them up that way. And if we take that approach, and let's say instead of us going from the outside in, we start from the middle, grab a middle piece. Well, there's a hole there. So it's not going to be whole. It's not going to be the full thing. There's going to be gaps. And where those gaps are, you're going to find, especially if it's out of alignment, out of order, it's going to be a little awkward to be able to navigate through the rest of this thing, because you started from a weird place. That might be a weird analogy, and I apologize for that. I'm kind of in a weird place of being hungry at the present moment, even though I'm full. I don't. It's neither here nor there. But that's the same thing, right? If we consider, even from another perspective of dealing with a leak in a pipe. If I don't patch the pipe up properly, there's a hole, or there's a crack that still hasn't properly sealed. When I go back to turn the water back on, the water's still going to seep through. And over time, that crack is going to resurface, and it's going to get worse, because what was supposed to heal and mend never did. And it's that same element. And we don't want to do that to ourselves, because that creates a lot of regrets, or what I would like to call the SWCs, shoulda, woulda, couldas. I should have did this. I would have did this. Could have did this. Wish I had done some things different, so on and so forth. Now, from a good perspective of fear, if we understand that the dynamic of the reverence, then we can find ourselves being precise. We be precautionary, because we understand the dynamic of what it means to fall out of alignment, or what it is to create or cause barriers and walls and other things of the sort, because things don't flow properly. A great example of that, consider what a dam is. It also opens the door for prevention. So we're preventing ourselves from going down certain paths because we know if this isn't what we're geared towards, or if this isn't something that we have the capability to be in, there's no need for us to go down that path. Right? And if we were instilled these things in a healthy environment or in a healthy manner, maybe the lessons that we were taught in this regard will help us to not step into those paths. This is why it's imperative for us to understand that dynamic when it comes to respect in the regard of fear. Because with the reverence, with the regard, I take what you say and I hold true to that. Vice, you controlling and impeding, and you're infiltrating everything that I'm doing and trying to basically vicariously live through what you want me to do for your own benefit, then, that's a different kind of thing. From this healthy place of fear, again with the reverence and the respect, there's a promotion of wisdom. And we're also very attentive because we understand with this place that we're in, we know that there are going to be a lot of things that are going to try to knock us off our rocker or wherever it is that we're standing on. And understanding not being intimidated by certain things. Because we know at the end of the day, if we can stay true to who we are, then obviously whatever comes, as a result of that, we understand that it's to get us to fall back in line. It's that other element of fear, right? The terrorism aspect. Great example of this, we go back to the Apostle Paul. This is a guy who operated from that place. I think we mentioned him earlier, and here's his Paul when he was a guy by the name of Saul. He was one of the most educated Pharisees in all of the land. He was a very smart guy, and he was cream of the crop. Very attentive, very keen guy. And he took to really opening the door for those that were following this new thing to really be persecuted, because they were challenging what the original idea of this religion was supposed to be. Right? The law was the traditions from the first 5 books. And the customs that were in those books, which if you want to go and look at them, it's Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Leviticus. And if you want to look at those, you can read those and see that what the old laws were supposed to be. And having an encounter with Jesus, the guy who started the new covenant and the new church, he realized that everything that he thought he was doing that was supposed to be in alignment with what the old tradition was wrong. And so he's finding himself having to rewrite the way that this thing goes. Not only that, but he's also trying to right the wrongs that he created. And for a lot of us, we can find ourselves resonating with Saul in that regard, because a lot of us, we live life a certain way. And a lot of the things that we might be pushing from a religious perspective may come off as that very same thing. Like I said earlier, the judgment, right? The impeding, the imposing, the control, the coercion, all of those things, right? The judgment, we push that and we think that is the way that it's supposed to go. But when Jesus reveals to us, when God shows us about this love thing and how like how we're really supposed to carry on as people, and what our true purpose is here. It's not about this religious thing. It's about a relationship. It's about connection, not just in a spiritual sense, but with our brothers and sisters. Then we become more like the Apostles Paul, where we find ourselves rewriting the things that were originally taught to us. We find ourselves becoming more and more like him in the regard where we're trying to right the wrongs that we created, some of the narratives that we may have pushed, some of the decisions that we may have made, the challenges that we may have created, maybe some of the bridges that we might have burned, whatever the case may be. When we find ourselves in this respectful place, understanding the dynamic of respect, fear, we can break a lot of the cycles and curses that we've experienced. Because from a respect place, if I really truly respect you, and I have reverence for you, and I love you, and I honor you, it's not necessarily that I have to put you on some pedestal, but I respect you, and my love and my respect for you should be a reflection of my love and respect for myself. That poses another one of those problems that we have within ourselves, is that we really don't love ourselves the way that we say we do. And when we get into the dynamic of really understanding the balance between our spiritual selves and our natural selves, and how those two guys are supposed to work together as one, as God purposed, then we'll find that the subtle jabs and digs that we take at ourselves won't be projected out the way that they are. In fact, we could take that even further if we really wanted to get into that whole element just in itself. Now, the danger of terror. We could look at 1 Peter chapter 3. We can read verses 13 through 18, and we can see what that says. And it says, "And who is he that will harm you, if you be followers of that which is good? But and if you shall suffer for righteousness' sake, happy are you. And be not afraid of their terror, neither be troubled, but sanctify the Lord God in your hearts. And be ready always to give an answer to every man that asketh you for a reason of the hope that is in you, with meekness and fear, having a good conscience, that whereas they speak evil of you as of evildoers, they may be ashamed that falsely accuse your good conversation in Christ. For it is better, if the will of God be so, that you suffer for well-doing than for evil-doing. For Christ also hath once suffered for sins, the just for the unjust, that he might bring us to God, and being put to death in the flesh, but quickened by the Spirit." Now here it is, Paul telling us about how getting into this dynamic, there are going to be people that are going to say things and do things. Again, that goes into that element of the terror, right? To get you to fall into line with whatever it is that the masses might agree to, or whatever the norm is, or whatever the status quo might be. And if that status quo is out of alignment with God, it's better to be in alignment and stand on truth than it is to go in a different direction or to do what everybody else is doing. I think there are quotes that are out there that kind of speak to that same thing. It's better to stand alone on truth than to go along with everybody else in a lie, or something along that line to that effect. You might be ridiculed for it, and it might seem awkward, and it might be a crazy thing, but if you really believe that that is what it is, that God is sharing with you and showing you, and if this is the principle that you believe on, then by all means you stand on it. I know that this might ruffle some feathers, and I'm not trying to do that from that standpoint. Like I said, I'm not trying to be political, but a great example of this in recent years is Colin Kaepernick. Here's a guy who stood for a certain thing. In an act of rebellion, he kneeled during the playing of the national anthem. And when asked about it, he spoke about why he was in that place. And it ruffled a lot of feathers. It made a lot of people angry, because you're disrespecting tradition and the people that stood for a certain place and certain things. And a lot of people really went to town on him about that and spoke bad about him and all of these other things. Now, there are some things that he did do outside of that where he was kind of trying to control the narrative in a specific way, but I'm not speaking to that. I'm just speaking to this particular act. And the beauty of what happened in that regard was a lot of things started to show itself. The more he was doing it until he was out of the league, the more we started seeing things that fell in line with that. We started to see people taking advantage of the position that they've held. This was heightened with the rise of COVID, and we see where this is, and we saw how that caused a movement. Now, like I said, I'm not in a political place. I'm not trying to tell you to think that this was good or to think that this was bad. I'm just stating it from as objective as I possibly can, from the standpoint of his belief when everyone else pushed a certain way. And then you see the movement that came from that. Now people are more cognizant of certain things, and they're pushing for more, elements in regard to those that are in leadership, to have more thorough checks and to see what kind of backgrounds some of these guys come from, and to see where they are, because we've seen this thing escalate in several different ways. I think about this time last year, there was a situation with a guy in Memphis, and we saw where that went. Right? And that again adds to the element that it wasn't just a one size, it wasn't one of those one-dimensional things, because we saw it in multiple facets. And then when we see the people that keep, that push and fight for that element of trying to keep things as they are, we can see what happens from a lot of different places in that space, right? Holding to a certain element of terror. We create delays, we create barriers and binds and yokes that come from this. Stunts growth, it stunts development, it stunts purpose. It stunts resolution. And we don't want to be in that place, right? We want to evolve. We say we want to unify. Well, the only way that we can do that is we have to be in a place where we're vulnerable. We might have to say some things and do some things that we may have to really accept, whether we like it or not, right? Because we don't want to be in a place of being in delusion where we're saying that this wasn't a thing, or this isn't a thing, or these things that doesn't exist. you might not experience this thing, but someone else might. And this is, again, how God looks at the dynamic of us being able to connect to each other in multiple facets, because I may not know what it's like to experience X, Y, and Z like you did. But if I can connect with you, maybe I can find some type of sympathy in understanding what that process looks like. Or maybe I can direct you in a place where I can connect you with someone who knows what that experience is like, so you can get the help you need. Whatever the case may be, I have to be present and available to offer some type of resolution. Can't do that if we're trying to keep things as they are. Which led into the next point, operating in facades and falsehoods to keep us from facing the truth. A lot of us will try to overcompensate so we don't really have to deal with the thing. But the thing is just as the word of God states, all things will be revealed in due time anyway. So there's no point in suppressing this thing. And this also holds true from an individual perspective. From an individual perspective, if there's something that I haven't dealt with, it's going to come out. I'm going to have to deal with it at some point. It's going to be made manifest. So the more that we try to hide secrets and carry on in things of that place, the more that those things will eventually be projected out. In fact, when we talk about from a mental health place, or when we talk about from a behavioral health place, a lot of the people that project out certain actions and thoughts and things along that line are doing so because it's that energy trying to come out. It's not supposed to be within us. That's why we do so much study on these things. We can oftentimes also in that same place be tormented or manipulated and controlled. And that's part of what the Antichrist or the enemy wants, is he wants us to stay in that place and keep things as they are, because everybody suffers as a result of that. Think about Judas. Judas was one of the 12 disciples, male disciples that we know of, that followed Jesus and saw all of the many wonderful things that he did and gave himself up and turned and betrayed Jesus for a couple bags of silver. And after realizing what he did, he couldn't live with himself. Literally, couldn't live with himself. And he hung himself. You think about King Herod. Think about Abimelech. These were guys who did the same thing. They were terrorists, for lack of better words. They did a lot of stuff that was wrong, evil, mean, manipulative, controlling. And they found themselves in some very gruesome positions when it all came crashing down. And from this place of terror, we can see how it enhances and furthers the cycle of curses and promoting discord. We become super polarized, and we can see what that looks like in today's day and age. In this climate, everything is polarized now. If you're not on one side, you're automatically on the other. You can't be in the middle in anything in this day and age. It's really hard to be. You can't be one to try to be well informed and see the what one side could be or what another side could be. No, we're polarizing everything. And everybody's pushing that ultra loyalty to one side or the other, and then on top of that, we're attacking each other. You're wrong for being on that side, and you're wrong for being in this place, or you're wrong for believing in this, or you're wrong for saying this, or you're wrong for doing this. And we become so easily offended that we all just go back and forth with each other. And now we're just continuing to create more chaos on top of chaos. And we're trying to force people into buying into whatever it is that we think. And whoever has the bigger voice and the bigger support wins. And that disrespect is terrible. And then from the last place that we go into with regard to this is respect. And when we find ourselves in a place of being respectful, we're modeling ourselves after Jesus' example. And that's what he came for. Right? He came to be the embodiment of what the law was. And he found a way to simplify it so it's not over the top. And I'm not saying that the Old Testament was over the top, but it was so difficult for us to follow because we didn't really understand it. And we found ourselves relying more so on trying to live that thing than we were trying to be connected to God, that we value the tradition more so than we did the relationship. And so that hurts us, right? Another thing that we can find ourselves really recognizing when following after his example is how he did everything. He did everything through a place of love. Yeah, he hid a lot of things in plain sight, but he also knew how to reach each and every person that he dealt with. He was able to meet them where they were and speak to them and build them up and change their lives for the greater good. When we see that, it helps us to then be able to find that balance with the spiritual element and the natural element, because it also tells us in the Bible that our bodies are temples and we have to treat our bodies as such. And when we find ourselves balanced with our spiritual and our natural beings, we can see the clear, free-flowing, united sound as God's character. Because everything is flowing as it's supposed to be. I can discern a lot better. I can see things a lot clearer. I'm not looking at them from a broken lens. Or as stated in 1 Corinthians 13, from a dark lens. The woman at the well is a great example of this. Right? Here's a woman who had a long, deep conversation with Jesus, and not only did he show her who he was, but then he told her that she was good. She is forgiven. She is healed. Go be free. The man at the pool, at the healing pool. This is another great example. Here's a guy who found himself, in a place of being held up because he couldn't do anything. And Jesus knew how to speak to him in a way to get him to stand up and to rise and to be his full self, both in the spirit and in the natural. Think about the story of Zacchaeus and Nicodemus. These are two different guys who found themselves in unique situations, and God having conversations with them about that. How to follow in his footsteps. Being that example. And being able to have conversation with them about how to do it. So it's not something over the top. And from this place of respect and being whole, we break the cycle of curses, just like we do with understanding the dynamic of respect, fear. right? That reverence, because we're being in a place of being whole. We're understanding the dynamic of what we're here for. It's not just a thing. It's just not a thing that we're doing to just be here to be here. No, we're being here to do a specific work. So when we look at this element, right, we look at understanding what respect, fear, and terror are. When we see the difference between respect, fear, and terror fear, we can say that respect fear is in alignment with God's will and purpose, because we're reverencing what he is and what he's about, and we're not imposing or interfering with that. While terror fear breaks God's desire for us to have free will, because we're doing our own thing and we're out of alignment, and we're trying to, we're doing what we think is best. That is very dead. But it also puts us in a place where we have to maintain a certain level of control. And as long as we're in control, then the things work in our benefit. I was going to utilize as an example a pyramid, right? Or a Ponzi scheme, right? As long as everything flows up as it's supposed to, then no one has a problem. But like most Ponzi schemes, eventually somewhere along the line, the flow doesn't move as freely as it's supposed to, and then everything crashes and everybody suffers as a result of that. Right? But that's you manipulating and controlling someone else to give to you, and to continue to give to you, and to continue to give to you, and to continue to give to you. And you're operating on and taking advantage of their feelings. In fact, when we truly value someone or something, we fear failing or letting that person or thing down because of our respect for that thing or that person. We value the freedom of flow, and hindering or controlling that flow for our own benefit means that we truly don't value that thing. And we fear being isolated and removed from that thing. In other words, if I truly believe and have love and respect for something, then I'm going to give it the utmost respect. And as we find, as we had read in 1 Peter chapter 3, even if someone is crossing the line and speaking bad and trying to do whatever they can to put us in a certain place, we still love them the same. We don't change that. Because again, with God and how free-flowing he is, he's also very consistent. He doesn't change who he is. He doesn't compromise who he is. And a lot of us, we have to understand that dynamic too, because being out of that alignment is really simple, especially with where we are in today's day and age, having been in a place where we're far removed from the original sin, the original misalignment, because there's so much that's been added on to this thing, because that door has been opened and that whole dynamic. So let's take that time to really imitate Christ's example and extend reverence and respect for other people, to other people. We don't judge. We help. We don't impede. We don't control. We don't manipulate. We guide. We help. We love. A lot of us, when we think about this type of respect, or we think of this type of fear, right, the respect fear, we oftentimes think of this as weaker compared to control and we'll actually abandon this to be more forceful. Right? In a lot of a lot of times in today's day and age, we think of being stern and assertive as a good thing, and in some cases it's necessary, but in a lot of other cases it really isn't. Well, a lot of us, we'd rather be right than be respected. And I know that throws a lot of people off. Well, why can't I have both? Sometimes you might not be able to have both. And it's not so much the dynamic of, again, whether we're trying to, whether we are being right or not. It's that forceful aspect. Might burn a bridge that way. Whereas allowing that person to be able to see for themselves, that's a whole different element. We can guide them and help them to see that for themselves, but forcing them to follow this thing pushes them further away. And we have value deficiencies as a result of not learning what real reverence and respect are. Because, we take certain stances, and our understanding of this thing, again, goes back to what we talked about earlier with the terror, the control, the being oppressed and oppressing, and understanding that correlates to what we consider respect. In fact, with regard to terror fear, it's commonly used to cultivate respect and obedience, and that's what we think when we think of the element of respect fear. And again, like we talked about, is far from the truth. And a lot of us do that because it feeds the desire to be in control. And a lot of us in that place, we push that element of control because we've been rendered helpless at some point or another. We've been restricted at some point or another. And we'll take that. And from being in that place, we enjoy it, but it does give us a false sense of power. We think we're in control. And that might be great, but best believe it does have its drawbacks if we're operating in the wrong place. Being a military vet and having, had my experiences in that element, no, it gets real. A lot of us will say, and we've said, or we'll act on, we'll listen to what a certain person may or may not say because of their rank, but we may not respect or value that person. And that dictates the quality of life in that element. I'm only doing this because I have to, and because I have to, I'm not really going to put forth the effort that I normally would put forth to make sure that this thing gets done right. Because I don't value you. So when it comes to this idea of embracing respect fear, we have to understand that we want it in an ideal sense to be a two-way street. But even if it isn't, we carry out that consistency. In the word, it tells us to not let our good be evil spoken of. And if I'm holding true to who I am, and I'm being consistent, and I'm showcasing my character and standing true on the principles that I'm standing on, no matter what you say or do to try to knock me off that place, you can't help but to accept and respect what I've been doing. And one of the ways that we can practice that is to ask ourselves who we are as a whole. This requires us to take the time to assess what's good about us, what's not so good about us, because that transparency in and of itself will remove a lot of those boundaries and barriers and walls and other things that stop us from really flowing in the totality of who we are. And in that same regard, as we're finding ourselves building and cultivating and operating in that respect aspect, we're also removing that terror fear, because we're learning how to trust all the more. There are certain things that we start to realize with regard to that element of control, that we don't have the ability to control everything. We can only control what we can control. And the more we realize that, the less we try to control everything around us. And again, that speaks volumes, because without that, we'll continue to do that same thing and we'll continue to operate in that same place. In fact, summarizing this up, understanding that respect fear is a beautiful thing. This isn't one of those elements that we should be blurring or putting down or rejecting. We should fully and wholeheartedly embrace this thing. There's a lot of healing. There's a lot of growth. There's a lot of development. There's a lot of wholesomeness that comes from this place. Whereas finding ourselves in a place of coercion and terror and manipulation and control and terror fear really puts us in a place where we won't grow and develop, and we'll continue to push and enhance certain cycles of brokenness and corruption and discord. That's not what God wants for us. Right? God's will and purpose was always for everything to be united and operating in wholeness. That's where life comes from. Combining all of these things to work together, that's life. So let's embrace that. Let's choose life. Let's choose alignment. Father, I thank you for this time that you've brought us together to learn about respect and terror in terms of fear. I pray that we find ourselves really learning and delving into the idea of embracing respect and reverence, as opposed to control, manipulation, and coercion. Lord, I pray that we learn to unblur the line between the idea of fear, where we think that we have to be in control of everything. You gave us free will, which means we have the decision to do what is required of us. And Lord God, I pray that we find ourselves really being able to embrace that in its totality. That we don't find ourselves walking in a place where we think that we know what's best for ourselves or for those that we're trying to control. But we allow for ourselves to embrace the example that Christ led. Because Christ was whole in who he was. He understood who he was. He knew what he had to do. He knew where he stood. And he allowed himself to operate in that fullness. He didn't control anything. He didn't force anything. And I pray that we operate that same way. I pray your will be done in all of us, Father. I thank you and I love you. In your holy and heavenly name I pray. Amen. Brothers and sisters, I take pleasure in doing this, and I thank you really for coming out and listening to what we have today. And I pray that this finds you well. I do hope that, we do take the time to embrace respect, and that we embrace reverence and awe for God's will, God's purpose. That we embrace and reverence ourselves as a whole, and that we stop pushing certain levels of discord and division and separation and division amongst ourselves, both as individuals and as a community, as a whole. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Rebuild Podcast, and I'm your host, Sean Romy. I love you all, and I pray that you find your purpose. Until next time, peace.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. Tune in weekly as we dive into topics such as finding your calling, overcoming obstacles, building resilience, and strengthening your relationship with God. If you're ready to embark on a transformative journey of faith and personal growth, then join us on the Rebuild Podcast. Together, let's build a solid foundation that aligns with God's will and leads us to a life of purpose and fulfillment.